everyone, this is Mr. P here with lesson number 12 of the Black Freedom Struggle unit, where we'll be doing a comparative analysis of the Albany and Birmingham campaigns in order to analyze the differences in these campaigns to help us better understand the paradox of repression. Just a reminder, links to the articles on the campaigns are here below on the slide, and you can see Classroom for the Eyes on the Prize, episode number 4 on both of these campaigns. So let's get started. I'll disappear and make this full screen. So let's begin with an overview of the Albany campaign and in Birmingham. The Albany campaign was seek to both enfranchise Black voters and integrate public facilities. Began with local students from the Albany State College running this campaign with the support of SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who had come in to support the local students and residents. King did not lead this campaign. He was brought in later to advise and give speeches after SNCC and the local leaders were struggling to achieve some success. They used a range of strategies, nonviolent strategies, from mass meetings to petitions and sit-ins. Singing emerges as really important here, which we'll talk about in a moment. The important thing to note here is the actions that Police Chief Laurie Pritchett took in order to try and quell the campaign. So he told his police not to beat protesters. Many local cities did not take that particular step. This police chief studied, and he's been interviewed, the Eyes on the Prize episode highlights this, he's been interviewed as saying that he studied the campaigns of the civil rights movement to make sure he understood that beatings and violence on the part of police often would lead to publicized national publication and attention on the campaign, which would often lead to federal government intervening on the side of the civil rights movement. So he intentionally used mass arrests and not mass beatings to prevent the campaign's success. He contacted nearby counties to make sure that they had space when they arrested Black voters to avoid overflowing the Albany jail. This ensured that the goals were not met. However, we will talk about, how SNCC expanded their organization to include the Freedom Singers because of how important singing was in this campaign. First thing I wanted to mention is in terms of highlighting some specific things about the campaign, Charles Sherrod's testimony from SNCC, someone who had been working in the Albany campaign, he's interviewed in the Eyes on the Prize episode, mentioned here that the obstacle to remove and he's talking about, local residents, was the mental block in the minds of those who wanted to move but were unable for fear that we were not who we said we were. So SNCC organizers had to kind of overcome some distrust. These are, SNCC organizers, are outsiders, not from Albany necessarily. And he goes on to say that, that they mocked the system that teaches men to be good Negroes instead of good men. The people began to think. And so this highlights the importance of political education, the kinds of conversation and education that would have to be had before even action could be taken. Bernice Reagan here, a local leader and student from Albany State College and the local secretary of the NAACP Youth Chapter, highlights the importance of song. So she writes that growing up in Albany, she learned that if you bring Black people together, you bring them together with a song. And she goes on to talk about an experience when they were arrested. And after this first march, we're at Union Baptist Church. Charlie Jones of SNCC looks at me and says, "Bernice, sing us a song." And I started, "Over my head, I see trouble in the air." By the time I got to where trouble was supposed to, I didn't see any trouble. So I put freedom in there. That was the first time I had the awareness that these songs were mine and I could use them for what I needed them to. This is sort of important because I ended up being arrested. And she goes on, it's not quoted here, talking about the importance of song while in jail as a way to maintain high energy and bring community together. This was really what led to SNCC forming a group known as the Freedom Singers. The other piece here is there was some way in which the campaign was beginning to work. It didn't ultimately, but it was beginning to. And that's because their boycott effectively pressured local merchants to try and contact police chief to do something. Much of, and this quote particularly highlights that. So you can pause and read about how this letter was trying to put pressure on the police chief because the local merchants were feeling the loss of Black business, of Black people buying at their stores. So let's move into the Birmingham campaign. So Albany, police chief uses mass arrests but not mass beatings, and the campaign is effectively stopped. They do not achieve their goals. In Birmingham, King ends up coming in with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to support the local organization, the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights. They had began this campaign by doing a sit-in at a lunch counter, but they were struggling to achieve their goals, and so they brought in SCLC and Dr. King to be co-leaders in this movement. Now, King accepted that proposal because he knew they needed a win after Albany. He knew the movement needed a win after Albany. And he thought the conditions were right in Birmingham. Alabama had a governor that was hostile to civil rights. They had a police chief who was particularly white supremacist. They had business leaders who did not hire Black people. This police chief, Bull Connor, was known for, using police brutality against Black people in Birmingham. And so this campaign demanded desegregation. It also demanded fair hiring practices and a timeline for a group to develop a timeline for desegregation of the Birmingham schools. So after some of those initial sit-ins and marches, there was a particular march in April that led to this image here, which got national publication, national attention, where local protesters were attacked by the police dogs. And these photographs ended up, getting national news. More people joined the movement, but it still wasn't enough. They needed more people in the movement. So they transitioned to something known as the Children's Crusade. They began recruiting school-age children, started in a church. You can see the Eyes on the Prize episodes for some of the images of those meetings in the church and the singing and songs that they started with. But they did a children's march, known as the Children's Crusade, otherwise known as Operation D-Day, to intentionally try and get more publication for the campaign. Malcolm X and others critiqued this decision, putting children in harm's way. And the response was beating of children, thousands of children getting arrested. Fire hoses were used on these youth in the movement. And ultimately, this did create enough pressure and for the federal government to kind of step in and kind of put some pressure on as well. And ultimately, local white business leaders sat down and made a compromise with the movement, the campaign leaders, to agree to desegregation within 90 days and fair hiring within 60 days. And this kind of led to the end of the movement, of the campaign. If you're on my slides, you can pause and watch this clip of Bull Connor. Actually, if we play it here, I think you'll be able to hear it.
You can never whip these boys if you don't keep you in separate. I found that out in Birmingham. You've got to keep the white and the black separate.
And so you can see there the virulent white supremacy of Police Chief Bull Connor. The Children's Crusade, if you want to watch more, Eyes on the Prize has it. This clip has it too. Begins in a local church. Singing is crucial in this campaign, but once they get out and are marching,
the whole issue before the conscience of the local and national community. And I think in a real sense, this Birmingham movement is one of the most inspiring developments in the whole nonviolent struggle.
So the goal was to, have this moral appeal, and ultimately it leads to incredible violence and attacks and kind of chaos on the campaign, where fire hoses were unleashed on protesters and children, and this is what gets the federal government's attention. So the difference there between this response in Birmingham and this response from Laurie Pritchett in Albany is crucial. So you want to pause and some writing here. To what extent do the differences in local police response explain the differences in outcomes? And you want to make sure that you're utilizing the term paradox of repression in your response, right? When nonviolent campaigns lead to physical and coercive force to repress the campaign, but instead of stopping it, it leads to outrage and helps grow the campaign. So you're gonna pause, do some writing on this, and then come back to the rest of the video. And so you would have done some writing and noticed that the paradox of repression is present in Birmingham, but not in Albany, because they did not provoke a violent, in terms of physical violent response from the Albany police, but they did in Birmingham. And that was crucial. It was a game of getting media attention to people like the federal government in to put pressure on local leaders. There are monuments now in Birmingham that pay homage and remember the brutality on children in the Children's Crusade. Those are able to be visited when you're in Birmingham. I want to close out with a bit of a look at Dr. King's letter from the Birmingham jail when he was arrested during the Birmingham campaign. And here he's responding specifically to criticism of white clergy. White clergy had delivered a statement or had written a statement where they criticized Dr. King and the campaign for being unwise and untimely. And Dr. King responds to these criticisms. You can read the full letter here. So with, I would pause and go through this slide and this slide to do some writing on how does Dr. King respond to the criticism of white clergy. And so you'll notice, assuming you've paused and done something on your own, and I'll just guide you through it here. You'll notice that, right, he mentions they describe the campaign as unwise and untimely, and they ask, why direct action? Isn't negotiation better? And he says, well, nonviolent direct action is about creating a crisis that fosters tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. So this is about dramatizing the issue, polarizing the issue, revealing the inherent violence in the system in order to, right, bring the opposing side to the negotiating table because they had refused to negotiate for decades. And so that's important to note there. He also brings forth the criticism of, why didn't you give the new city administration time to act? That's the criticism from white clergy. And he says, freedom is never voluntarily given. It must be demanded. This notion of wait, give people time, always amounts to never, he says. Justice too long delayed is justice denied. And so King really highlights the importance of not waiting and resisting that criticism of, well, give folks time to act. They've had time, and this is about pressuring them, right? Quickening the pace at which they will respond. And finally, he addresses the criticism of, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? And he talks about some laws are just and some are unjust. We have a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws, and one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. And that's what civil disobedience in the civil rights movement ultimately does. And finally, I want you to use this quote to consider what he sees as an obstacle to Black freedom. And this is one of my favorite quotes from King, because he writes, I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in the stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, the citizen council professional class mostly of folks who oppose segregation, the Ku Klux Klaner, referring to people who use physical violence to oppose the civil rights movement. And he says, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than justice, who paternalistically feels he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by the myth of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait until a more convenient season. And here, really criticizing the white liberal, the white moderate, not just those who use physical violence, but those who kind of say, oh, yeah, we agree, but maybe let's wait, that kind of thing. So think about how you can apply this, this kind of quote to today, perhaps. And finally, I would take a look at this speech starting at around, I think, minutes 50 seconds, where Kennedy responds to the Birmingham campaign, specifically riots that not endorsed by the campaign, not part of the nonviolent action that pressured Kennedy to where people raised their concerns and pressured Kennedy to propose civil rights legislation. So ultimately, the campaign got a victory in getting civil rights legislation on the agenda of the federal government.